I want to begin tonight by correcting a mistake almost everyone listening to me has made, though very few will admit it. You are not failing because you lack imagination. You are not failing because you lack belief. And you are certainly not failing because you are doing it wrong. You are failing for a far quieter reason. Nothing you assume ever seems to grow. You imagine something once, perhaps even feel it vividly, and then nothing multiplies, nothing expands, nothing takes root. And you wonder why your life looks the same year after year, even though you know the law. Now listen to me carefully, because this is where it gets interesting. Consciousness does not respond to intensity. It responds to faithfulness. And most of you have never been faithful to a single state in your life. You visit states the way a tourist visits cities, briefly, emotionally, and without commitment. You imagine success, wealth, relief, freedom, and then you leave the moment appearances disagree. And when you return to anxiety, calculation, and fear, you are shocked that nothing multiplies. But why should it? Consciousness multiplies only what you feed. And tonight I want to show you why nothing you have ever assumed has grown, by revealing what I meant when I said, feed my sheep. Now most people hear that phrase and immediately make it mystical, moral, or religious. I meant none of those things. I was not speaking of charity, kindness, or good deeds. I was speaking of something far more exact and far more unforgiving. Your sheep are your habitual inner act. Your sheep are the thoughts you consent to when no one is watching. Your sheep are the states you return to when the initial excitement fades. And feeding is not effort. Feeding is returning again and again. Let me put this in the simplest possible terms. If you imagine wealth once, consciousness does nothing. If you imagine it for a week, consciousness does nothing. If you imagine it with emotion, with tears, with excitement, consciousness still does nothing, because consciousness is not impressed by moment. It is impressed by resonance. This is the part most people never hear, and it is why so many feel quietly betrayed by the law. They were told to assume, to feel, to let go, and so they assume one, feel one, let go, and then return to being exactly who they were before. And consciousness faithfully multiplies that instead. Now stay with me here, because if you miss this, nothing else I say will matter. You do not get what you imagine. You get what you remain. And remaining is not glamorous. Remaining is not exciting. Remaining does not feel like manifestation content. Remaining feels ordinary, quiet, repetitive, almost boring. And that is precisely why it works. I told the story of a shepherd for a reason. A shepherd does not create sheep. He does not inspire them. He does not hype them up. He feeds them daily. And the flock grows. Not because of a dramatic moment, but because of steady nourishment. Your inner life works the same way. You do not starve because you missed one meal. You starve because you stop eating altogether. And yet that is exactly what most of you do with your assumptions. You assume a state, and then you abandon it. You feel relief, and then you replace it with worry. You glimpse freedom, and then you return to calculation. And then you ask me why nothing changed. Let me tell you something that will sound harsh, but it is law. Consciousness never withholds. It only multiplies what you feed. Now this brings us to a story I told that many people misunderstand. The parable of the talent. Most people think this parable is about money. It is not. Others think it is about morality. It is not. It is about what happens to a state when you neglect it. 3 servants are given talents. not rewards, responsibilities. One servant doubles what he is given. Another does the same, and the third, out of fear, caution, or false humility, buries his talent in the ground. Notice this carefully. The third servant does not lose the talent. He does not spend it. He does not misuse it. He does nothing with it. And for that, it is taken from him. Now, this is where most people grow uncomfortable, because they want a kinder universe than the one consciousness actually is. The servant is not punished for fear. He is not punished for doubt. He is punished for neglect. And this is where many of you are right now. You are not doing anything wrong. You are doing nothing consistently. You assume states the way people start diets, enthusiastically, briefly, and without changing identity. And when results do not appear quickly, you bury the assumption and call it letting go. But consciousness calls it something else. It calls it abandonment. Now, if this feels confronting, that is good. It means you are listening. Because the law is not here to comfort you. It is here to operate. And here is the most important thing I will say now. If nothing in your life was ever multiplied, money, opportunity, freedom, ease, it is not because you assumed wrongly. It is because you never fed the assumption long enough for it to grow. And now I'm going to show you exactly how you have been burying your own talents quietly, politely, and every single day without realizing it. Now let me show you how most people quietly bury their talents without ever intending to. They do it politely. They do it rationally. They do it while believing they are being intelligent, cautious, even spiritual. And this is where many of you will recognize yourselves. You begin by assuming a state. Perhaps it is relief. Perhaps it is financial ease. Perhaps it is simply the feeling that life is working for you instead of against you. You enter it sincerely. You feel the calm of it. You may even say it is done. And then something happens. Nothing appears to change. So you check. You look at the world. You look at numbers. You look at circumstances. You look for confirmation. And in that very moment, without drama, without realizing it, you step out of the state you just assumed. Not because you are weak, but because you were never taught what faithfulness actually means. Most people believe faithfulness is emotional intensity. It is not. They believe it is certainty. It is not. They believe it is effort. It is not. Faithfulness is return. It is returning to the same inner position again and again, especially when there is no evidence to support it. And that is why so few ever do it. You live in an age of constant stimulation. You are trained daily, hourly, relentlessly to move from feeling to feeling, from idea to idea, from state to state. Your attention is pulled in 1,000 directions, and you call this being informed, being realistic, or staying grounded. But consciousness has no interest in your reason. It only responds to what you dwell in. This is why effort exhausts you. Effort requires constant decision-making. Faithfulness requires none. Effort says, what should I do next? Faithfulness says, I already know who I am. Now this is where most people misunderstand me. So listen closely. I am not asking you to pretend the world is different. I am not asking you to deny appearances. I am not asking you to force emotion or suppress fear. I am asking something far simpler and far more difficult. I am asking you to stop leaving. Most of you leave your assumed state dozens of times a day. You leave it when you check the news. You leave it when you check your bank balance. You leave it when someone speaks doubt into your ear, and you consent to it internally. And then you wonder why the state never ripens. Let me tell you something that may surprise you. The law does not require belief. It requires residence. A state does not manifest because you are convinced. It manifests because you live there long enough for it to feel ordinary. This is why sudden imaginal acts rarely change a life. But quiet assumptions eventually reshape everything. And this brings us back to the servant who buried his talent. That servant did not reject the talent. He did not say, I don't believe in this. He did not mock the gift. He simply chose safety over faithfulness. He chose to wait. He chose to observe. He chose to see how things would turn out. And by doing so, he ensured that nothing would ever turn out differently. Now, if you are honest with yourself, you will see this pattern everywhere in your life. You assume a better condition, and then you wait to see if it works. You imagine abundance, and then you watch expenses more closely than ever. You feel relief, and then you ask how it will happen. And each time you do this, you are not being cautious. You are withdrawing nourishment. Consciousness does not punish you for doubt. It simply multiplies what you feed instead. So if you return again and again to anxiety, calculation, and vigilance, consciousness will faithfully grow those states into your experience. Not because they are true, but because they are fed. This is where many people misunderstand the phrase letting go. They believe letting go means abandoning the assumption. It does not. Letting go means abandoning the need to check. The state remains. Only the anxiety leaves. And this distinction changes everything. Oh, here is something most people never consider. The servant who multiplied his talent did not watch it grow. He did not check on it daily. He did not dig it up to see if it was working. He simply continued from the same position. This is what I mean when I say the faithful servant. Faithfulness is not stubbornness. It is not emotional rigidity. It is loyalty to an inner conclusion. And this is why money, opportunity, and ease follow certain people seemingly without effort. They are not imagining harder than you. They are not more deserving than you. They are not more spiritual than you. They simply do not live. They live from an assumption the way you live from worry. And consciousness, being impartial, multiplies accordingly. Now this is the point where many people feel resistance. They say, but surely I must do something. Of course you will act. But action flows from state, not the other way around. When you remain faithful to a state, action reorganizes itself naturally. Decisions become obvious. Timing aligns. You are moved without strain. But when you jump from state to state, action becomes frantic, forced, exhausting. And then you mistake exhaustion for effort, and effort for virtue. Let me be very clear here. I am not glorifying passivity. I am exposing inconsistency. The law is not impressed by motion. It is impressed by continuity. And this is why so many people feel they are doing everything right, and yet nothing changes. They are faithful to methods, but not to identity. They are loyal to techniques, but not to state. They are servants who never become friends. And this brings us to the next progression, one that most never make. The servant obeys instruction. The friend communes. The son knows. And the difference between them is not effort. It is nearness. Now I want to show you how remaining faithful to a state transforms your relationship to imagination itself. How you move from trying to use the law to living from it. Because once you understand this, you will stop asking when things will change. You will know they already are. Now we come to a distinction that separates those who struggle with the law from those for whom life seems to cooperate effortlessly. It is the progression I described as servant, friend and son. Most people hear those words and turn them into poetry or theology. I did not mean them that way. I was describing degrees of relationship to imagination itself. Let me say that again, because this is where everything begins to change. I was not speaking of rank. I was speaking of closeness. The servant works for imagination. The friend communes with imagination. The son lives from imagination. And nearly everyone listening to me remains a servant long after they have learned enough to become more. The servant follows instructions. The servant applies techniques. The servant asks, am I doing this right? And how long will it take? The servant imagines because he is told to imagine. There is nothing wrong with this stage. Every one of us begins there. But the servant never stays long enough in one state to know it. He assumes, then doubts. He feels, then checks. He imagines, then asks how. And so imagination always feels like work. The friend is different. The friend no longer imagines to get something. The friend imagines because it is natural. The friend returns to the same inner position, not out of discipline, but familiarity. The state feels known, comfortable, recognizable. And because of this, the friend stops watching the world for confirmation. He speaks inwardly, as one speaks to a trusted companion. He no longer forces scenes or emotions. He simply communes. This is why I say that Moses spoke with God face to face as a man speaks with his friend. Not because Moses was special, but because he remained near. Now the Son is something else entirely. The Son does not imagine in order to change the future. The Son imagines because this is where he lives. The Son does not check. The Son does not wait. The Son does not ask when. Why would he? He is not visiting the state. He is the state. And this is the point where time collapses, not because of magic, but because of identification. Let me make this very practical. When you are hungry, you do not imagine food to convince yourself you will eat later. You simply expect to eat. You live from the certainty of nourishment. The thought of food comes and goes naturally, without strain. That is sonship. And when you reach this relationship to a state, whether it is security, abundance, or freedom, life has no choice but to rearrange itself accordingly. Not because you are demanding it, but because you have stopped leaving. Now this is where many people misunderstand my teaching about living in the end. They believe living in the end means maintaining excitement. It does not. They believe it means visualizing constantly. It does not. They believe it means denying reality. It does not. Living in the end means thinking from, not of. A servant thinks of wealth. A friend communes with the feeling of sufficiency. A son thinks from abundance without naming it. And this is why those who truly live from a state often struggle to explain how things happen. They did not watch it unfold. They did not track progress. They did not measure movement. They simply remain. This is why I say that imagination creates reality, and reality catches up later. Now, let me speak directly to something many of you are feeling. You are tired. Not because manifestation is difficult, but because you are constantly shifting identity. You are rich in imagination for a moment, then poor in reaction, calm in assumption, anxious in observation, confident in prayer, fearful in conversation. And that internal friction drains you. You think effort is the problem. It is not. Oscillation is the problem. Consciousness does not punish oscillation. but it cannot multiply it either. A seed does not grow because it is planted repeatedly. It grows because it is left alone in fertile soil. Unfaithfulness is simply leaving the seed where it is. Now this brings us to something very important, something rarely discussed. The law is not slow. You are. Not because you resist, but because you abandon. Every time you leave a state, you reset the process. You do not undo it, but you stop feeding it. Unconsciousness waits patiently for you to return. This is why some things seem to almost happen again and again. You get close. You feel movement. You sense alignment. And then you leave. And life mirrors your loyalty with perfect accuracy. Now, I want you to hear this clearly, because it will free you from a great deal of self-judgment. You do not need more discipline. You do not need more belief. You do not need more technique. You need fewer departures. Remain long enough and effort disappears. Remain long enough and time collapses. Remain long enough and what felt extraordinary becomes ordinary. And once it is ordinary, it is done. Let me now address something directly, because I know what many of you are thinking. You are saying, but what about action? What about work? What about money in the physical world? Good. Because now we are ready to speak about why wealth follows this law with ruthless precision, and why chasing it never would. Now let us speak plainly about money, because by this point you are ready to hear the truth without distortion. Money is not special, it is not sacred, and it is not difficult. It is obedient. Money follows consciousness the way a shadow follows a body. And if the shadow appears distorted, delayed, or absent, the problem is never the shadow. It is the position of the body. Most people approach money the way servants approach imagination. They work at it. They chase it. They attempt to persuade it. And in doing so, they reveal the very state that repels it. Need, urgency, watching. Now this is important, so stay with me. Money does not respond to desire. It responds to identity. And identity is not something you claim. It is something you remain faithful to when no reward is visible. This is why those who truly understand the law often struggle to explain their financial changes. They did not manifest money. They did not perform rituals. They did not repeat affirmations until something happened. They simply stopped living from lack. And because they stopped feeding lack, lack could no longer multiply. Now I want to address a misconception that keeps many people trapped. They believe wealth comes from effort. It does not. They believe it comes from hard work. It does not. They believe it comes from strategy. It does not. Effort, work, and strategy are expressions, not causes. They flow naturally from state. When you live from insecurity, action becomes frantic. You do more, try harder, monitor constantly, and no matter how much you earn, it never feels sufficient, because the state you are feeding is insufficiency, and consciousness, being faithful, multiplies it. But when you live from sufficiency, even quietly, action reorganizes itself. You choose differently. You speak differently. You move when movement is natural, and rest when rest is correct. And money follows, not because you demanded it, but because it has no choice. Let me say this as clearly as I can. You do not attract money. You permit it. And permission is given through residence, not desire. Now this is where many people grow impatient. They say, but surely I must see something happening. Of course you will. eventually. But the moment you demand evidence, you step back into the servant's role. You leave identity and return to observation. And observation always reports the past. The world you see today is not responding to what you are assuming now. It is responding to what you were faithful to yesterday. And when you understand this, you stop arguing with appearances. You stop negotiating with reality. You feed the state and let the law do the rest. This is why chasing money never works. Chasing reveals distance. Distance feeds lack, and lack multiplies itself endlessly. But those who stop chasing are often surprised to find money arriving through channels they never planned, not because they were lucky, because they were still. Now let me address something very practical, because I know what some of you are thinking. You are asking, does this mean I do nothing? Number. It means you do nothing from fear. Action taken from fear compounds fear. Action taken from sufficiency compounds ease. The outer act may look the same, but the inner state determines the result. This is why two people can perform the same work and receive wildly different outcomes. One is feeding trust. The other is feeding desperation. And consciousness multiplies accordingly. Now here is something that will save you years of struggle if you hear it. Money is not impressed by how badly you want it. It is impressed by how little you need it. And I do not mean physical need. I mean psychological dependence. The moment you stop needing money to feel secure, valuable, or complete, money loses its resistance to you. Not because you rejected it, but because you stop placing it above your identity. Now this is where the servant becomes the prince. The servant asks, how will I get it? The friend asks, who am I remaining as? And when you remain faithful to the latter, the former answers itself. This is why I say imagination is God. Not because it grants wishes, but because it determines position. And position determines everything that follows. Now I want to bring this all together, because understanding alone is not enough. I want to show you how faithfulness actually feels in daily life. Not as effort, not as discipline, but as something surprisingly gentle, and why once you experience it, you will never return to chasing again. Let me show you what faithfulness actually looks like in daily life, because many of you imagine it to be far more dramatic than it is. Faithfulness is quiet. It does not announce itself. It does not feel heroic. It does not demand recognition. In fact, if you are looking for proof that you are being faithful, you have already left the state. Faithfulness is simply remaining inwardly consistent when nothing seems to require it. You wake up in the morning, and before the world has made its demand, you return not to effort, not to visualization, but to identity. You feel again what it feels like to be secure, settled, provided for. Not excited, not euphoric, just normal. And then you go about your day. When a thought of concern arises, you do not wrestle with it. You do not argue. You do not suppress it. You simply do not feed it. You let it pass the way you let an unimportant conversation pass in a crowded room. And when the state you have chosen gently reasserts itself, you accept it again without ceremony. This is feeding, not force, not repetition, not struggle. Return. Most people think feeding a state means constantly thinking about it. It does not. That would be effort. Feeding means not contradicting it. If you have assumed sufficiency, you do not spend your inner life rehearsing scarcity. If you have assumed ease, you do not continually revisit strain. If you have assumed freedom, you do not habitually imagine constraint. And when you notice yourself doing so, you simply stop. and return. This is why I say imagination is a discipline, not because it is harsh, but because it requires selection. You're always feeding something. Every inner conversation nourishes a state. Every assumption spoken silently gives something life. And the state you feed most faithfully becomes the one you experience most fully. Now let me relieve you of a burden many of you are carrying. You do not need to be perfect. You do not need to maintain a state 24 hours a day. You do not need to eliminate doubt permanently. You only need to return more often than you leave. And eventually, you stop leaving at all. This is how a state becomes natural. At first it feels chosen, then it feels familiar, and finally it feels like you. And once it feels like you, the world has no choice but to conform. Now notice something important. At no point did I ask you to manipulate reality. At no point did I ask you to visualize outcomes obsessively. At no point did I ask you to convince yourself of anything. I asked you to be loyal to an inner conclusion. And loyalty is not effort, it is preference. You prefer one state over another. You prefer calm over worry. You prefer sufficiency over lack. You prefer trust over vigilance. And you make that preference quietly, again and again, until it is no longer a choice. This is why those who truly understand the law appear calm, even indifferent about results. They are not indifferent to life. They are indifferent to proof. They know the harvest comes because the seed is being fed. Now I want to say something that may seem almost too simple. But simplicity is the mark of truth. If you want your life to change, you must stop asking, is it working? That question feeds the very state you wish to leave. Instead, ask only one thing. Where am I returning? Because whatever you return to, day after day, thought after thought, will become your world. And if you are honest, you will see that most of what troubles you today is not new. It has been fed for years. Worry, fed daily, becomes a life of worry. Struggle, fed daily, becomes a life of struggle. Waiting fed daily becomes a life of delay. And the reverse is equally true. Ease fed quietly becomes ease lived openly. Sufficiency fed inwardly becomes provision outwardly. Trust fed faithfully becomes opportunity naturally. This is the law. It is not sentimental. It is not cruel. It is precise. And once you understand it, you stop begging life for change. You simply feed something different. Next, I want to leave you with this understanding firmly in place. Not as a technique, but as a way of living. So that you no longer chase results, but allow them to arrive as the natural consequence of who you have chosen to be. Now let us return to the words that began this entire discussion. Feed my sheep. I did not say visit your sheep. I did not say encourage your sheep. I did not say check on your sheep. I said feed them. And feeding is an act of responsibility, not excitement. When I spoke those words, I was not offering comfort. I was describing a law as impersonal as gravity. Whatever you feed grows. Whatever you neglect withers. And whatever you abandon is taken from you. Not in punishment, but in consequence. This is why so many people feel as though life is slipping through their fingers. It is not because life is cruel. It is because they are inattentive to what they are nourished. You do not drift into abundance. You do not drift into freedom. You do not drift into ease. You feed your way there quietly, repeatedly, faithfully. And once you understand this, a great deal of struggle falls away. You stop trying to fix the world. You stop demanding signs. You stop asking when. You become far more interested in where you are returning inwardly. because you now know something most people never realize. The world you see is not demanding your belief. It is reflecting your loyalty. So I want to speak directly to the one who feels discouraged. You may be thinking, I have tried this before. You may be thinking, I assumed and nothing happened. You may be thinking, I stayed faithful for a while, and then life pulled me back. Good. That tells me you have already begun. Do not condemn yourself for leaving. Simply notice where you return. Every return strengthens a state. Every departure weakens it. And eventually, something remarkable happens. You stop arguing with life. You stop fighting appearances. You stop correcting people inwardly. You stop rehearsing explanations for why things are the way they are. You live from a quiet knowing. And from that knowing, the world rearranges itself with surprising ease. This is what it means to move from servant to friend, and from friend to son. The servant obeys instruction. The friend communes with imagination. The son lives from it without effort. And when you reach that place, you will notice something important. You are no longer impressed by lack. You are no longer flattered by excess. You are no longer shaken by delay, because you know what you are feeling, and you trust the law to do what it always does: multiply. If you take nothing else with you tonight, take this. Your life is not waiting on a breakthrough. It is waiting on faithfulness. Not faith in something outside yourself, but faithfulness to an inner conclusion you have already touched. Feed that conclusion. Return to it when the day begins. Return to it when the world disagrees. Return to it when nothing seems to be happening. And then leave it alone. Do not big it up. Do not measure it. Do not defend it. Let it grow, because the same law that multiplies worry into hardship will multiply sufficiency into provision. The same law that multiplies fear into limitation will multiply trust into freedom. And it will do so without effort, without drama, and without delay, once you stop leaving. That is what I meant when I said, feed my sheep. And that is all you will ever ask to do.